I never imagined that the most painful moment of my life wouldn't be the surgery itself, but what happened afterward. My name is Marta. I'm 55 years old, and I'm about to tell you a story that changed everything I believed about love, sacrifice, and family. The fluorescent lights in that hospital hallway were buzzing like angry insects, casting their harsh white glow on what would become the worst day of my life. I was sitting in a wheelchair, still wearing that thin hospital gown that barely covered my dignity, with fresh bandages wrapped around my abdomen where they had just removed a tumor that had been growing silently inside me for months. The surgery had been risky. The doctors warned me there could be complications, that recovery would be slow and painful, but I wasn't afraid of the physical pain. I had endured so much worse in my life. What I feared was being alone, and foolishly, I believed I wouldn't be. After all, I had raised a son. I had given him everything. Surely, when his mother needed him most, he would be there. But as I sat in that cold wheelchair, watching other patients being picked up by loving families, watching children hug their parents and spouses hold hands while walking toward the exit, I realized how naive I had been. My son Daniel was nowhere to be seen. The nurse had tried calling him 3 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. "I'm sure he's just running late," the nurse said with that practiced smile that hospital staff use when they're trying to be kind but know something is wrong. Sometimes traffic can be unpredictable. I nodded, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't about traffic. This was about priorities, and apparently, I wasn't one of them. You see, I had dedicated my entire adult life to Daniel. When his father walked out on us when he was just 8 years old, I became both mother and father. I worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and working at a factory during the day. My hands were permanently stained from industrial chemicals. My back ached from bending over desks and machines. But it was worth it because Daniel needed new shoes. Daniel needed school supplies. Daniel needed college tuition. I remember the countless nights I would come home exhausted, my feet swollen and my eyes burning from fatigue, only to find Daniel's homework spread across our small kitchen table. I would sit with him, helping him with math problems I barely understood myself, because education was the one thing I could give him that no one could take away. When he graduated high school with honors, I cried tears of joy. When he got accepted to a prestigious university, I took out loans I knew I'd spend decades paying off. When he needed a car for his internship, I sold my grandmother's wedding ring, the only valuable thing I owned. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in our future together. "Mom, you're the best," he used to say, hugging me tight after I would surprise him with something he needed. "I promise I'll take care of you when I'm successful. You'll never have to worry about anything." Those words sustained me through the loneliest nights, through the backaches and the exhaustion, through the moments when I wondered if I had anything left to give. They were my anchor, my hope, my reason to keep going when everything else felt impossible. But sitting in that wheelchair, still bleeding from surgery, still weak from anesthesia, I began to understand that promises made by children don't always survive the reality of adult selfishness. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward reaching 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment below to let us know which city you're watching from. An hour passed, then 2. The hallway grew quieter as the afternoon shift change brought new faces, new voices, new families coming and going. I watched them all, these strangers who seemed to have what I thought I had, people who cared enough to show up when it mattered most. My phone finally rang just as the evening sky was turning purple outside the hospital windows. It was Daniel's number, and my heart leaped with relief and hope. He was probably stuck in traffic, probably frantically looking for parking, probably worried sick about his mother. "Daniel," I answered, my voice weak but grateful. "Honey, I've been waiting for you. The surgery went well, but I need you to pick up my prescription medications before the pharmacy closes." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that lasted just long enough to make my stomach clench with an unfamiliar dread. "Mom, I can't make it today," he said, his voice flat and emotionless, as if he were declining an invitation to a casual dinner rather than abandoning his mother in a hospital. "I'm busy with work stuff. You'll figure it out. But, Daniel, I whispered, confusion and desperation creeping into my voice. I can barely walk. The doctor said I shouldn't be driving for at least a week. I just need you to— Look, I'm not wasting my money on your medications, he interrupted, his words hitting me like physical blows. You got yourself into this mess with your health problems. Deal with it yourself. And then he hung up. I stared at my phone, certain that what had just happened was some kind of mistake, some terrible misunderstanding that could be cleared up with another call. The words echoed in my mind. I'm not wasting my money on your medications. This from the son whose college education I had paid for with money I didn't have. This from the young man whose every need I had prioritized over my own for 27 years. This from the child I had rocked to sleep when he had nightmares, whose fever I had stayed up all night monitoring, whose broken heart I had mended when his first girlfriend left him. The nurse who had been so kind earlier appeared beside my wheelchair, her expression concerned. She had clearly overheard enough of the conversation to understand what had happened. Is there someone else I can call for you, honey? She asked gently, her hand resting on my shoulder with the kind of maternal comfort I realized I had been giving my whole life but never receiving. I looked up at her through tears I hadn't realized were falling and shook my head. There was no one else. I had spent so many years focused on being Daniel's mother that I had forgotten to build a life beyond him. My friends had drifted away as I worked multiple jobs and devoted every free moment to his needs. My own dreams had been set aside so completely that I could barely remember what they had been. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible above the hum of the hospital's ventilation system. There's no one else. That kind nurse, whose name I learned was Patricia, helped me into a taxi that night. She even paid for my medications from her own pocket, refusing to let me repay her. Sometimes we have to be the family we wish we had, she told me as she handed me the prescription bag. Her words would echo in my mind for months to come. The taxi ride home felt like a funeral procession. Every street corner reminded me of moments with Daniel. The park where I taught him to ride a bike. The ice cream shop where we celebrated his good report cards. The library where we spent countless Saturday afternoons when I couldn't afford other entertainment. All those memories, once precious, now felt tainted by the knowledge of how little they had meant to him. My small apartment welcomed me with the silence of a tomb. It was the same place where Daniel had grown up, where his height measurements were still penciled on the kitchen door frame, where his childhood drawings were still taped to the refrigerator, even though he was now 27 years old. Looking at those faded drawings felt like looking at evidence of a love that had only flowed in one direction. The first few days after surgery were a blur of pain medication and restless sleep. But it was during those long, quiet hours that I began to see my relationship with Daniel more clearly than I ever had before. The signs had been there for years, but I had been too blind, too hopeful, too devoted to notice them. I remembered his last birthday party, 6 months earlier. I had spent weeks planning it, cooking his favorite foods, inviting his friends, buying him an expensive watch I couldn't afford. When he opened the gift, he barely glanced at it before setting it aside. "Thanks, Mom," he had said with the enthusiasm someone might show for receiving junk mail. Later that evening, I overheard him talking to his girlfriend on the phone. "Yeah, it's just some cheap thing my mom got me. I'll probably return it." The girlfriend, Sarah, 24 years old, beautiful, from a wealthy family that owned a chain of restaurants. She had made her feelings about me clear from the moment Daniel introduced us. The way she looked at my modest apartment, my second-hand furniture, my work-worn hands. It was the look someone gives to something unpleasant they're forced to tolerate. "Daniel deserves better than this," she had whispered to him once, not realizing I was within earshot in my own kitchen. "When are you going to stop letting her drag you down?" And slowly, gradually, he had started to agree with her. The visits became less frequent, the phone calls shorter. When I would try to share news about my life, a small promotion at work, a new book I was reading, a neighbor who had been kind, his responses grew more dismissive. "That's nice, Mom," he would say in a tone that clearly indicated it wasn't nice at all, that my small joys were interruptions to more important matters in his life. The final insult had come 3 weeks before my surgery. I had called to tell him about the tumor, about the upcoming operation. about how scared I was. His response was burned into my memory. "Well, you're getting older, Mom. These things happen. I'm sure you'll be fine." No offer to come with me to doctor appointments. No questions about my prognosis. No acknowledgement that his mother was facing the possibility of cancer, alone. Just a casual dismissal, as if I had called to complain about the weather. But even then, even after that crushing indifference, I had clung to the hope that when the moment truly mattered, when I was lying vulnerable in a hospital bed, my son would remember who had raised him. I had convinced myself that crisis would awaken whatever love still existed between us. Instead, crisis had revealed the truth I had been too afraid to face. I had raised a stranger who saw me as nothing more than an obligation he was eager to shed. The phone rang occasionally during my recovery. Never Daniel. Sometimes it was Patricia, checking on how I was healing. Sometimes it was my supervisor at work, asking when I might be able to return. Sometimes it was automated calls from bill collectors, mechanical voices demanding payments for medical expenses my insurance didn't cover, but never my son. I found myself standing at my kitchen window for hours, looking out at the neighborhood where other families seemed to function the way I had always imagined families should. I watched adult children visit their elderly parents, saw grandchildren playing in yards while grandmothers watched with obvious joy, witnessed the kind of intergenerational love I had always assumed would be my reward for decades of sacrifice. One afternoon, as I was slowly walking to the mailbox, still moving carefully because of my healing incisions, I ran into Mrs. Chen, my neighbor of 15 years. She had always been kind, always asked about Daniel with genuine interest. I hadn't seen her since before the surgery, and her face lit up when she spotted me. "Marta, how are you feeling? Daniel told me about your operation when I saw him picking up some things from your apartment last week." The words hit me like cold water. Daniel had been to my apartment? When? Why? And why hadn't he bothered to check on me while he was there? He seemed in such a hurry, Mrs. Chen continued, oblivious to my shock. Had several boxes with him. Said he was helping you organize some old things. My hands began to shake as the implication became clear. I mumbled some excuse to Mrs. Chen and hurried back inside, my healing body protesting the sudden urgency of my movements. I went straight to my bedroom, to the closet where I kept my most precious possessions. The shoebox that contained my mother's jewelry was gone. The small savings I kept hidden in an old coffee can, money I had been setting aside for emergencies, gone. Even the silver picture frames that held our family photos had disappeared, leaving only the photographs themselves scattered on the shelf like abandoned memories. He had robbed me. While I was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from surgery, my own son had come into my home and stolen the few valuable things I owned. Things that weren't just worth money, but were irreplaceable pieces of my history, my family's legacy. I sat on my bed and wept for the first time since the hospital, not just for the stolen items, but for the death of something I hadn't realized was already dying. The mother-son relationship I had treasured, nurtured, and sacrificed everything to preserve had been nothing but an illusion. I had been loving a ghost, caring for someone who had stopped existing long ago, if he had ever existed at all. The Daniel I had raised, the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them flowers, the teenager who had once hugged me and promised to take care of me forever, that person was gone. In his place was a stranger who saw me as nothing more than a source of guilt, inconvenience, and now, apparently, easy money. That night, I called his number one last time. I needed to hear him admit what he had done, needed to understand how someone could steal from their own mother while she was recovering from surgery. The call went straight to voicemail, just like all the others. But this time, I left a message. "Daniel, I know you took my things. I know you were in my apartment while I was in the hospital. I just want to understand why. After everything I've given you, after everything I've sacrificed, how could you do this to me?" He never called back. But somehow, sitting in my violated home, surrounded by the evidence of my son's betrayal, I felt something shift inside me. The desperate need for his love, the crushing weight of his rejection, the suffocating hope that things might somehow get better between us. All of it began to transform into something else, something that felt almost like relief. 3 weeks into my recovery, I made a decision that would prove to be the most humiliating mistake of my life. Despite everything that had happened, despite the theft and the abandonment, I convinced myself that maybe Daniel was just going through a difficult phase. Maybe Sarah was influencing him badly. Maybe if I could just reach out one more time, show him how much I still loved him, we could repair what had been broken. I had always been a fighter. When his father left us, I didn't give up. When money was tight, I found ways to make it stretch. When Daniel struggled in school, I worked with him until he succeeded. This situation would be no different, I told myself. I just needed to try harder, love more, give him one more chance to remember who I was to him. So I did something that makes me cringe with shame even now, months later. I planned a surprise visit to his apartment. I had never been to the place he shared with Sarah. In the 2 years they had been living together, he had never invited me over. When I asked about visiting, he would always have excuses. They were too busy, the place was too small, Sarah wasn't feeling well. I had accepted these rejections with the patience of a mother who didn't want to seem pushy or demanding. But now, with my world falling apart and my relationship with my son hanging by a thread, I decided to show up unannounced. I would bring his favorite homemade cookies, the ones I used to make for his school events. I would apologize for whatever misunderstanding had caused this distance between us. I would prove that I was still the loving, supportive mother he had once needed. The apartment building was in a part of town I rarely visited, all glass and steel and expensive cars in the parking garage. Standing in the marble-floored lobby, surrounded by modern art and designer furniture, I felt every year of my 55 years, every stain on my discount store clothing, every callus on my working hands. I took the elevator to the 14th floor, my heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and hope. Maybe this grand gesture would be exactly what we needed. Maybe seeing me make this effort would remind Daniel of all the times I had gone out of my way for him when he was younger. I stood outside apartment 1407 for a full minute before knocking, rehearsing what I would say, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Through the door, I could hear voices. Daniel's laugh, Sarah's higher-pitched giggle, the sound of music and conversation that suggested they were entertaining guests. When Daniel opened the door, his face went through a series of expressions that I will never forget as long as I live. First confusion, then recognition, then something that looked almost like panic, and finally, resignation mixed with unmistakable annoyance. "Mom," he said, not moving aside to let me in, not asking about my recovery, not showing any sign that he was happy to see me. "What are you doing here?" Behind him, I could see into their beautifully decorated living room. Sarah was there, dressed in an elegant black dress, her hair perfectly styled. There were other people too, well-dressed couples holding wine glasses, the kind of sophisticated gathering I had only seen in movies. "I brought cookies," I said, holding up the container like a peace offering, suddenly aware of how pathetic I must look. "Your favorite ones, with chocolate chips. I thought maybe we could talk, and I could meet your friends." Sarah appeared behind Daniel, her face wearing an expression of barely concealed horror. "Daniel," she said in a stage whisper that was clearly meant for me to hear, "I thought you said she wouldn't be a problem anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. A problem. That's what I had become to my own son. Not a mother, not family, not someone deserving of basic respect. Just a problem to be managed and hopefully eliminated. "This really isn't a good time, Mom," Daniel said, glancing back at his guests with obvious embarrassment. "We're hosting a dinner party for some important people from Sarah's father's business. These are potential investors, and—" "I understand," I interrupted, though I didn't understand at all. "I just thought, maybe after your guests leave we could—" "Look," he said, lowering his voice but not enough to keep his words private. "You can't just show up here unannounced. This is our home, and you don't fit in with our life here." I stared at him, this stranger wearing my son's face, speaking words that seemed designed to cause maximum damage with surgical precision. "You don't fit in with our life." As if I were some random person trying to insert myself where I didn't belong, rather than the woman who had created the very life he was now living. One of the dinner guests, a man in an expensive suit, approached the door with curiosity. "Everything all right, Daniel?" he asked, looking at me with the kind of polite confusion people reserve for unexpected disruptions to their evening plans. "Everything's fine," Daniel said quickly. "This is just someone from my old neighborhood." She was just leaving. Someone from his old neighborhood. Not his mother. Not the woman who had raised him. Just someone from his past that he was eager to dismiss and forget. Sarah stepped forward, her smile sharp as broken glass. "I'm so sorry," she said to me with false sweetness. "But as you can see, we're in the middle of something important. Perhaps you could call next time before visiting." The way she said call made it clear that no call would ever be welcome, that this suggestion was merely a polite way of saying, "Never come here again." I stood there in that hallway, holding my container of homemade cookies, feeling smaller and more insignificant than I had ever felt in my life. Behind them, I could see the dinner party continuing. Beautiful people in beautiful clothes, living beautiful lives that apparently had no room for someone like me. "I should go," I whispered, backing away from the door. "I'm sorry for interrupting." But before I could turn to leave, I heard Sarah say to one of the other guests, just loud enough for me to catch the words, "That's Daniel's mother. She doesn't really understand boundaries. We've been trying to manage the situation delicately." Manage the situation. That's what my love had become, a situation to be managed. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt endless. I watched the numbers descending, 14, 13, 12, 11, counting down like the final moments of something that was dying inside me. When the doors opened onto the marble lobby, I walked out into the night air feeling like I had just attended my own funeral. I sat in my car in their parking garage for 20 minutes, crying so hard I couldn't see to drive. All around me were luxury vehicles that cost more than I made in 3 years. Symbols of a world where I would never belong, where my son had apparently decided he belonged without me. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and tears. I kept replaying the scene, examining every word, every expression, every moment of humiliation. The way Daniel had looked at me like I was an embarrassment. The way Sarah had spoken about me like I was a pest to be eliminated. The way I had stood there with my pathetic cookies, trying to buy back the love of a son who had already sold it to someone else. When I got home, I threw the cookies in the trash. Then I took out every photo I had of Daniel and spread them across my kitchen table. Baby pictures, school photos, graduation pictures, candid shots of us together during happier times. I stared at them for hours, trying to find the exact moment when the loving child in these pictures had transformed into the cruel stranger I had just encountered. But maybe that was the wrong question. Maybe the real question was when I had stopped being a mother and become merely an inconvenience. When had my love become a burden instead of a gift? When had my presence become something to be ashamed of rather than cherished? The phone rang around midnight. For a wild moment, I thought it might be Daniel calling to apologize, to explain that he had been under pressure from his guests and hadn't meant those terrible things he had said. Instead, it was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a young woman's voice said, "Is this Marta Rodriguez?" "Yes," I replied cautiously. "This is Amy from Premier Credit Services. I'm calling about several outstanding debts that have been assigned to our collection agency. According to our records, you owe $847 to City Medical Center, $1,200 to Advanced Imaging Associates, and $2,340 to Dr. Harrison's surgical practice. These accounts are now seriously delinquent. More bills from my surgery. More consequences of the medical crisis that had revealed just how alone I really was. The insurance I had thought would cover everything had turned out to be inadequate, leaving me responsible for costs I had no way of paying. I'm making payments," I said weakly, though I knew the small amounts I had been sending were barely covering the interest charges. "Mrs. Rodriguez, at your current payment rate, these debts will take 17 years to resolve. We need to discuss a more realistic payment plan." 17 years. I would be 72 years old before I finished paying for the surgery that had saved my life but cost me everything else. And that was assuming no other medical emergencies, no other crises, no other moments when I would need help that apparently no one was willing to provide. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my dark kitchen and realized something that should have been obvious weeks ago. I was completely and utterly on my own. Not just temporarily, not just until things got better, but permanently. The safety net I had thought I was building by raising a loving son had never actually existed. I was 55 years old, recovering from major surgery, buried in medical debt, and abandoned by the only family I had. And somehow, in that moment of absolute clarity about my desperate situation, I felt the first stirring of something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt angry. The anger that had flickered to life that night didn't last long. By morning, it had faded back into the familiar ache of loss and rejection. I woke up on my couch, still wearing the clothes I had worn to Daniel's apartment, my face swollen from crying, my body stiff from sleeping in an uncomfortable position. For weeks after that humiliating visit, I stopped trying. I stopped calling. I stopped hoping he would call me. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes, waiting for a message that never came. Instead, I fell into a routine that felt like slowly drowning in plain sight. I would wake up, take my medications, eat whatever was cheapest and required the least effort to prepare, usually toast, sometimes a can of soup if I was feeling ambitious. I would sit by my window, watching the neighborhood come alive with people who had places to go and people who cared about them. Mrs. Chen would wave from her garden sometimes, and I would wave back, but I stopped going outside to chat with her. I didn't want to risk her asking about Daniel again. Didn't want to have to pretend that everything was fine when everything was falling apart. The medical bills kept coming. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, each statement showing balances that grew larger despite my small payments. The collection calls became more frequent, more aggressive. Some days I would just let the phone ring, too exhausted to deal with another conversation about money I didn't have. My supervisor at the factory had been patient about my extended recovery time, but patience has limits. When I finally returned to work, moving slowly and still tender from surgery, I could see the concern in her eyes. Not concern for my health, but concern about my productivity, my reliability, my value as an employee. "Take it easy your first week back," she told me. But her tone suggested this consideration wouldn't last long. In a workplace where younger, healthier people were always looking for opportunities, a 55-year-old woman with recent health problems was a liability waiting to happen. The other workers were kind enough, asking how I was feeling, mentioning that they had missed me, but I could see the way they looked at the stack of work that had accumulated during my absence, the overtime shifts they had been forced to cover, the inconvenience my illness had caused them. My son helped take care of everything while I was recovering. I lied when someone asked how I had managed. The lie came so easily, it scared me. It was easier than explaining that I had been completely alone, easier than admitting that the child I had sacrificed everything for had abandoned me when I needed him most. Evenings were the worst. The apartment felt cavernous and silent, filled with echoes of conversations that would never happen again, meals that would never be shared, holidays that would never be celebrated together. I found myself talking to the photographs on my refrigerator, asking Daniel's 8-year-old face why he had grown up to be so cruel. "Remember when you used to help me make cookies?" I would whisper to his school picture. "Remember when you said I was the best mom in the world?" But pictures don't answer, and memories don't pay bills or provide comfort when you're sick and scared and completely alone. 3 months after the surgery, I received a piece of mail that made my hands shake as I opened it. It was an invitation to Daniel's engagement party, addressed formally to Ms. Marta Rodriguez, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than the groom's mother. The invitation was elegant, expensive-looking, with gold lettering announcing the upcoming marriage of Daniel Rodriguez and Sarah Mitchell. The party was being held at the Grandview Country Club, a place so exclusive I had only heard about it in passing conversations at work. At the bottom, in smaller print, it mentioned that the couple was registered at several upscale stores where gifts started at prices that represented half my monthly salary. I stared at that invitation for hours, trying to decide if it represented an olive branch or a final insult. Was this Daniel's way of including me in his life again? Or was it simply a social obligation, a way to avoid the awkward questions that might arise if the groom's mother wasn't present at his engagement celebration? The more I thought about it, the more I realized it was probably the latter. Sarah had likely insisted on proper etiquette, ensuring that all the appropriate people were invited regardless of personal feelings. I was being included not because I was wanted, but because excluding me might reflect poorly on them in their sophisticated social circle. But despite everything, despite the theft and the humiliation and the months of silence, some desperate part of me clung to the possibility that this was a chance for reconciliation. Maybe at the party, surrounded by family and friends, Daniel would remember the love we used to share. Maybe he would introduce me proudly, tell stories about his childhood, acknowledge the woman who had made his success possible. I spent my last bit of savings on a dress for the occasion. Nothing expensive, nothing that would make me stand out, just something appropriate for a mother attending her son's engagement party. I had my hair done at a salon for the first time in years, spending money I couldn't afford because I wanted to look like I belonged, like I deserved to be there. The country club was everything I had imagined and more. Valet parking, marble columns, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than I made in a year. Walking through those doors, I felt like an imposter wearing a costume, trying to blend in with people who belonged to a world I could never afford to enter. The engagement party was in full swing when I arrived. Beautiful people in beautiful clothes, holding glasses of champagne and conducting the kind of sophisticated conversations I had only heard in movies. And there, in the center of it all, was Daniel. He looked handsome in his expensive suit, confident and successful, every inch the accomplished young man I had raised him to become. Sarah stood beside him in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her engagement ring catching the light like a small star on her finger. I approached them nervously, clutching the small gift I had brought, a picture frame engraved with, "To my son and his beautiful bride," that had taken me weeks to save up for. "Daniel," I said softly, touching his arm to get his attention. He turned, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe even a hint of genuine pleasure at seeing me. But then Sarah appeared at his side, and his expression shifted back to that familiar mask of polite indifference. "Mom," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I'm glad you could make it." But even as he spoke those words, I could see him glancing around, checking to see who might be watching this interaction, calculating how quickly he could end it without causing a scene. I held out the gift, suddenly aware of how modest it looked compared to the elaborate presents displayed on a nearby table. "I brought this for you both," I said. "I know it's not much, but that's very thoughtful," Sarah interrupted, taking the gift with a smile that never reached her eyes. "We'll add it to the collection." And just like that, I understood that my presence was being tolerated, not welcomed. I was a social obligation to be managed, a potentially embarrassing relative to be handled with careful politeness until I could be dismissed. For the next 2 hours, I stood in corners and along walls, watching my son celebrate his future with people who didn't know I existed. When acquaintances asked Daniel about his family, he would mention Sarah's parents, their successful business, their social connections. When someone specifically asked about his mother, he would give vague, dismissive answers that made it clear the subject wasn't worth pursuing. I watched him laugh and joke with Sarah's father, a successful businessman who clearly approved of his future son-in-law. I watched him embrace Sarah's mother, an elegant woman who welcomed him into their family with obvious affection. I watched him pose for photographs with everyone except me. When it was time for toasts, Sarah's father spoke eloquently about welcoming Daniel into their family, about the bright future ahead for the happy couple. Sarah's mother talked about how perfect they were together, how lucky they were to have found each other. No one mentioned the woman who had raised Daniel, who had sacrificed everything to make his success possible, who had loved him before anyone else even knew he existed. As the evening wound down, I made one last attempt to connect with my son. I found him alone for a moment, adjusting his tie in a mirror. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I'm so proud of you. I know I haven't said it enough, but everything you've accomplished, everything you've become, it makes all the hard times worth it." He looked at me through the mirror, and for just a second, I thought I saw a flicker of the boy I remembered, but then he turned away. "Thanks, Mom. I need to get back to Sarah." And he walked away, leaving me standing alone in front of that mirror, looking at a woman I barely recognized. A woman whose love had been deemed insufficient, whose presence was an embarrassment, whose very existence seemed to be something her own son wanted to forget. I left the party without saying goodbye to anyone. I drove home through streets filled with people celebrating Saturday night, people who had family and friends and places where they belonged. Back in my small apartment, I sat at my kitchen table and looked around at the life I had built. The modest furniture I had saved for years to buy, the photographs of Daniel at every stage of his life, the Mother's Day cards he had made me in elementary school, still taped to my refrigerator after all these years. All of it suddenly felt like a museum to something that had never really existed, a shrine to a relationship that had been one-sided from the beginning. But I still had something they had forgotten about, something they didn't know existed. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to remember who I had been before I became Daniel's mother, before I lost myself in loving someone who had never learned to love me back. The something I had was a letter, hidden in an old jewelry box that Daniel hadn't bothered to steal, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a letter my mother had written to me just before she died. I had forgotten about it completely until that night after the engagement party, when I was going through old photographs and memories, trying to understand how I had become so invisible in my own son's life. My mother had been a strong woman, stronger than I had ever given her credit for when I was young and thought I knew everything about life and love. She had raised 3 children mostly alone after my father died in a factory accident, working multiple jobs and never complaining, never making us feel like burdens even when money was scarce and options were limited. But it wasn't until I opened that letter, sitting at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. with tears still drying on my cheeks, that I understood just how much wisdom she had tried to pass on to me. "My dearest Marta," the letter began in her careful handwriting, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are probably facing some difficult time in your life. I am writing this because there are things I never had the courage to say while I was alive, lessons I learned too late to share with you when you might have been able to hear them." I could almost hear her voice as I read, that gentle but firm tone she used when she was about to tell me something important that I probably didn't want to hear. "You have always had the biggest heart of all my children," the letter continued. "Even as a little girl, you would give away your lunch to classmates who forgot theirs. You would nurse injured birds back to health. You would cry when you saw people being cruel to each other. This kindness is your greatest gift, but it is also your greatest danger." I paused in my reading, remembering how often my mother had warned me about being too generous, too trusting, too willing to sacrifice my own needs for others. At the time, I had thought she was being pessimistic, maybe even a little selfish. Now I began to understand she had been trying to protect me from exactly the situation I found myself in. "There is a difference," she wrote, "between loving someone and losing yourself in them. I watched you do this with boyfriends in high school, giving so much of yourself that you forgot who you were without them. I was afraid you would do the same thing when you became a mother, and I think perhaps you have." The words stung because they were true. I had defined myself entirely through my relationship with Daniel, measuring my worth by his achievements, my success by his happiness. When people asked me about myself, I talked about him. When I had free time, I spent it thinking about what I could do for him. When I dreamed about the future, it was always about his future, never my own. "Listen to me carefully, my dear daughter," the letter continued. "Love is not supposed to make you smaller. Real love, healthy love, makes both people grow. If you find yourself constantly giving while someone else is constantly taking, that is not love, that is consumption. And you, my generous girl, are allowing yourself to be consumed." I set the letter down for a moment, overwhelmed by how accurately my mother had predicted the path my life would take. She had seen this coming 20 years ago, had tried to warn me, but I had been too stubborn and too confident in my own judgment to listen. "Your worth," she had written, "does not depend on how much you sacrifice for others. Your value as a person is not measured by how much others need you or want you or appreciate you. You are valuable simply because you exist, simply because you are a good person with a kind heart and a strong spirit." The letter went on to tell me about her own struggles, her own mistakes in love and motherhood. She wrote about times when she had given too much, trusted too deeply, sacrificed too readily. She wrote about the moment she had learned to say no, to set boundaries, to protect her own heart even while loving others. "I want you to promise me something," the letter concluded. "Promise me that you will never forget who you were before you became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's caretaker. That girl, that young woman with dreams and ambitions and a life of her own, she is still inside you. And if the people in your life cannot love and appreciate that complete person, then they do not deserve any part of you." By the time I finished reading, dawn was breaking outside my kitchen window. I sat there watching the sun rise over a neighborhood where I had lived for 15 years but had never really belonged, where I had been so focused on being Daniel's mother that I had forgotten to be Marta Rodriguez. For the first time in months, I began to think about who that person was. Before Daniel, before marriage, before I had learned to define myself entirely through other people's needs and expectations, who had I been? I remembered the girl who had loved to read, who had dreamed of traveling to places she had only seen in books. I remembered the young woman who had wanted to learn languages, who had been fascinated by different cultures, who had imagined herself doing important work that mattered. Somewhere along the way, I had put all those dreams in a box and stored them away, telling myself they were selfish, impractical, less important than the immediate needs of the people I loved. I had convinced myself that being a good mother meant having no ambitions beyond motherhood, no identity beyond the role I played in someone else's life. But my mother's letter reminded me that I had been a complete person before Daniel was born, and I could be a complete person after he was gone. The dreams I had abandoned weren't dead. They were just sleeping, waiting for me to remember they existed. That morning, for the first time since my surgery, I didn't spend my time thinking about Daniel. Instead, I went to the library and checked out books about topics that interested me: art history, Spanish language, travel guides to places I had always wanted to see. I spent the afternoon reading not because I had to, not because someone needed my help with something, but simply because I enjoyed learning. It felt revolutionary. Over the following weeks, I began to notice things I had been blind to for years. The way my supervisor at work dismissed my ideas during meetings, but praised identical suggestions when they came from younger employees. The way my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, always asked me to help with errands, but never offered assistance when I needed it. The way I automatically said yes to every request for my time, my money, my energy, without ever asking what I needed in return. I started small. When Mrs. Chen asked me to drive her to the grocery store on my day off, I politely declined and suggested she call her daughter instead. When my supervisor assigned me overtime without asking, I informed her that I had other commitments and couldn't stay late. When the bill collectors called demanding payment plans I couldn't afford, I researched my rights and learned to negotiate from a position of knowledge rather than desperation. Each small act of self-preservation felt like a rebellion against the person I had trained myself to be, the one who always said yes, who always accommodated, who always put everyone else's needs before her own. But the biggest change was internal. I stopped checking my phone constantly, hoping for messages from Daniel. I stopped driving past his apartment building, torturing myself with glimpses of the life he was living without me. I stopped making excuses for his behavior, or imagining scenarios where we might reconcile. Instead, I began to focus on the life I was living right now, in this moment, as a 55-year-old woman who was still capable of growth, change, and happiness that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or affection. It wasn't easy. There were still nights when the loneliness felt overwhelming, when the silence in my apartment seemed to echo with all the conversations we would never have, all the milestones I would never share with him. There were still moments when I wanted to call him, to apologize for whatever I had done wrong, to beg for another chance to be the mother he apparently needed me to be. But my mother's letter had given me something I hadn't realized I was missing: permission to stop trying to earn love from someone who had no intention of giving it. The woman who had sat in that hospital wheelchair 6 months ago, desperate for her son's attention, would not recognize the woman I was becoming. I was learning to cook meals I enjoyed instead of meals I thought others would want. I was learning to spend evenings reading or watching movies I chose instead of waiting by the phone for calls that never came. I was learning to make plans for my future that didn't revolve around anyone else's needs or expectations. Most importantly, I was learning that love, real love, should never require you to disappear. The people who truly care about you want to see you grow and thrive, not shrink and sacrifice. They want to add to your life, not subtract from it. And if someone couldn't love the complete, complex, independent person I was becoming, then perhaps they had never really loved me at all. For the first time since Daniel's abandonment, I began to see his rejection not as evidence of my failure, but as proof that I had been trying to build a relationship with someone who was incapable of reciprocating genuine love. The problem wasn't that I hadn't given enough, or loved enough, or sacrificed enough. The problem was that I had been loving someone who saw my devotion as something he was entitled to take, rather than something he was lucky to receive. But that was changing. Everything was changing. And I was finally ready to discover who Marta Rodriguez could become when she stopped trying to be everything to someone who had given her nothing in return. 6 months after reading my mother's letter, I barely recognized my own life. What had started as small acts of self-preservation had grown into something much larger, a complete reconstruction of who I was and what I wanted from the world. I had enrolled in a Spanish class at the community college, something I had dreamed of doing for 20 years, but had always postponed because Daniel needed something, because money was tight, because there was always some reason why my education had to wait. Now, 3 nights a week, I sat in a classroom with people of all ages who were pursuing their own dreams, and I discovered I had a talent for languages that I had never known existed. "Señora Rodriguez," my instructor would say with a smile, "your pronunciation is excellent. Have you considered studying abroad?" Studying abroad. The suggestion would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, when my entire identity was wrapped up in being available for a son who never called. Now it felt like a possibility worth exploring. I had also started volunteering at a literacy center, helping adults learn to read. There was something deeply satisfying about watching a 50-year-old man sound out his first complete sentence, or seeing a grandmother write her own name for the first time. These people, like me, were discovering that it was never too late to learn something new, never too late to become more than what circumstances had originally allowed. The work gave me purpose that had nothing to do with sacrifice or suffering. I was using skills I had developed over decades: patience, encouragement, the ability to break complex ideas into manageable pieces. But I was using them for people who appreciated my efforts and gave back in return. Their progress was their own achievement, not something I could take credit for, but their gratitude was genuine, and their respect was earned rather than expected. My financial situation had also improved dramatically, though not in ways I could have predicted. After months of careful negotiation with the medical billing departments, I had managed to set up realistic payment plans that wouldn't bankrupt me. More importantly, I had learned to advocate for myself, to ask questions about charges, to dispute fees that seemed unreasonable. But the real change came when I applied for a position at the Literacy Center, a paid position coordinating their volunteer programs. The director, a woman named Elena who had immigrated from Mexico 30 years earlier and built the center from nothing, saw something in me that I was just beginning to see in myself. "You have natural teaching ability," she told me during the interview. "But more than that, you understand what it means to start over, to rebuild when everything falls apart. That's exactly what our students need to see, that it's possible to create a new life at any age." The salary was modest, but it was enough to cover my expenses without the constant stress I had lived with for months. More importantly, the work felt meaningful in ways that my factory job never had. I was helping people change their lives, and in the process, I was changing my own. My apartment, which had felt like a tomb for so long, began to feel like a home again. I rearranged the furniture, not to accommodate visitors who never came, but to create spaces where I could read, study, and pursue hobbies I had forgotten I enjoyed. I hung new pictures on the walls, not photos of Daniel, but prints of places I wanted to visit, quotes from books that inspired me, artwork I had created in a painting class I had joined on weekends. The most dramatic change was in how I responded to other people's requests for my time and energy. "Mrs. Chen still lived next door, but I no longer felt obligated to drop everything whenever she needed a favor. When she asked me to drive her places, I would suggest alternatives or offer to help her arrange transportation. When she complained about her family or her health, I listened with compassion but didn't try to solve her problems for her. "You've changed," she told me one afternoon, and there was something almost accusatory in her tone, as if my refusal to be endlessly available was somehow a betrayal of our friendship. "Yes," I replied simply. "I have." I didn't apologize for changing, didn't explain myself, or try to make her feel better about the fact that I was no longer the person she could rely on to handle whatever inconveniences arose in her life. The old Marta would have spent hours reassuring her, would have felt guilty for setting boundaries, would have probably ended up agreeing to whatever she needed just to avoid conflict. The new Marta understood that other people's discomfort with my growth was not my responsibility to manage. At work, I had also become a different person. Instead of quietly accepting whatever assignments were given to me, I began to speak up in meetings, to share ideas, to advocate for changes that would improve working conditions for everyone. Some of my suggestions were implemented, others were dismissed, but I no longer measured my worth by whether other people approved of my contributions. The factory supervisor who had once treated me like a replaceable piece of machinery began to view me with something approaching respect. When I announced that I would be leaving for the position at the literacy center, she actually seemed disappointed. "You've been one of our most reliable workers," she said, which would have once felt like the highest compliment I could receive. Now, I understood that reliability without recognition, loyalty without reciprocal care, was just another form of being taken for granted. But the most significant change was how I thought about Daniel. For months after his abandonment, every day had been colored by grief, anger, or desperate hope for reconciliation. I had measured time by how long it had been since I'd heard from him, marked milestones by his absence from them. Now, whole days would pass without me thinking about him at all. When memories did surface, they no longer had the power to destroy my peace. I could remember the good times we had shared without romanticizing them, could acknowledge the love I had felt without pretending it had been reciprocated in equal measure. I had stopped following his social media accounts, stopped asking mutual acquaintances about his life, stopped torturing myself with information about his happiness, his engagement, his career success, his life with Sarah. None of it was my business anymore, and more importantly, none of it was my responsibility. This detachment hadn't happened overnight. It was the result of months of small choices, daily decisions to focus on my own life, rather than the life he was living without me. Every time I felt the urge to call him, I called a friend from my Spanish class instead. Every time I wanted to drive past his apartment, I went to the library or the park or anywhere else that belonged to my new life, rather than my old pain. I had also begun to see a counselor, something I had resisted for years because it felt like admitting failure. But Elena had recommended someone who specialized in helping women rebuild their lives after major losses, and the sessions had been more helpful than I could have imagined. "Grief isn't just about death," Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions. "You're grieving the loss of the relationship you thought you had, the son you thought you knew, the future you thought you were building together. That grief is real and valid, but it doesn't have to define the rest of your life." She helped me understand that my devotion to Daniel hadn't been wrong, but it had been unbalanced. I had given so much of myself that there was nothing left for me, and when he rejected that sacrifice, I felt empty, because I truly was empty. I had poured everything into someone else's life, and forgotten to keep anything for myself. "Healing," she told me, "means learning to be a complete person again. It means rediscovering the parts of yourself that existed before motherhood and integrating them with the wisdom and strength you've gained through your experiences." As the months passed, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about my own future. I was making plans that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or expectations. I was saving money for a trip to Spain to practice my language skills. I was considering applying for a master's degree in education, something that would help me expand my work at the literacy center. I was dating, carefully and selectively, but I was dating. Not because I was desperate for companionship or trying to fill a void left by Daniel's absence, but because I was ready to share the full, interesting life I was building with someone who would appreciate and contribute to it. The woman I was becoming would have been unrecognizable to the person who had sat in that hospital wheelchair 8 months earlier, begging for scraps of attention from a son who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. That woman had been so diminished by years of one-sided love that she had almost disappeared entirely. This woman, the one I was now, knew her worth. She had interests, goals, friendships, and a future that belonged entirely to her. She was kind, but not self-sacrificing, generous but not self-destructive, loving but not desperate. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, as I was leaving the literacy center after a particularly satisfying day of teaching, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen in months but recognized immediately. It was Daniel. For a moment, I stared at the phone, remembering all the times I had prayed for this call, all the nights I had lain awake hoping he would reach out, all the fantasies I had constructed about how our reconciliation would unfold. But now, looking at his name on my screen, I felt nothing but curiosity, not desperation, not excitement, not even anger, just a calm, detached interest in what he might want after all this time. I answered on the fourth ring. "Hello, Daniel." "Mom," he said, and something in his voice was different. The confident, dismissive tone I had grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like uncertainty. "I need to talk to you. Can we meet somewhere?" "Of course," I replied, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "But I should mention that I'm quite busy these days. When were you thinking?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know about why he was calling. This wasn't about reconciliation or apology. This was about need, his need, not mine. And for the first time in my adult life, I was curious to see what my son needed from the woman he had thrown away. We met at a small cafe near the literacy center, a place I had discovered during my new life and had grown to love for its quiet atmosphere and excellent coffee. I arrived first, choosing a table by the window where the afternoon light was warm and golden, and ordered my usual, a cappuccino and a pastry I would have once considered too expensive for a casual afternoon treat. When Daniel walked through the door, I was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the confident, polished young man who had dismissed me at his engagement party. This person was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled and ill-fitting, his face bearing the unmistakable signs of stress and sleepless nights. His hair, usually perfectly styled, looked like he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. He spotted me immediately and approached the table with hesitant steps, as if unsure of his welcome. For a moment, looking at his uncertain expression, I felt an echo of the old maternal instinct to comfort him, to ask what was wrong, to offer whatever help he needed. But I remained seated, calm and composed, waiting for him to explain why he had requested this meeting after months of silence. "Hi, Mom," he said, settling into the chair across from me with obvious discomfort. "Thank you for meeting me. I know it's been a while." 8 months, I replied matter-of-factly, stirring my coffee with deliberate calm. "Not counting the engagement party where you introduced me as someone from your old neighborhood." The directness of my response seemed to catch him off guard. He had probably expected me to minimize his behavior, to make excuses for him the way I always had, to smooth over the awkwardness with maternal understanding and forgiveness. Instead, I simply waited for him to speak, studying his face with the detached interest of someone observing a stranger. This was not the reunion scene I had fantasized about during the worst months of my grief, where he would apologize tearfully, and we would embrace and rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and love. This was something else entirely. "I'm in trouble, Mom," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Big trouble. Sarah left me. The engagement is off, and there are other problems, financial problems that I don't know how to handle." He looked up at me with eyes that held a desperation I recognized because I had seen it in my own mirror not so long ago. The desperation of someone whose carefully constructed life had collapsed, leaving them alone and afraid, and grasping for help from anyone willing to provide it. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Not because I felt responsible for his pain or obligated to fix it, but because I was genuinely sorry that another person was suffering, the way I would be sorry for any acquaintance facing difficulties. "The thing is," he continued, clearly struggling with how to frame his request, "I made some bad investments. Sarah's father was giving me advice about money, and I trusted him completely. I invested everything I had, plus money I borrowed against my salary, in some business ventures he recommended." I sipped my coffee and waited for him to continue, noting how he was already setting up his story to deflect responsibility. Not, "I made poor financial decisions, but I trusted someone else's advice." Not, "I was reckless with money, but I was given bad guidance." "It turns out he was using me," Daniel went on, his voice growing more bitter with each word. "The investments were fake, elaborate schemes designed to funnel money to his other businesses. When everything collapsed, I lost everything. My savings, my credit, even my job. The company fired me when they found out about the financial mess I was in." I could see where this story was heading, could predict the request that was coming, but I let him continue without interruption. This was his moment to reveal who he really was, and I was curious to see if he would take any responsibility for his choices, or if everything would continue to be someone else's fault. "Sarah found out about the money problems and immediately broke off the engagement," he said, his voice cracking with what sounded like genuine pain. "She said she couldn't be with someone who was so stupid with finances, someone who couldn't be trusted to make good decisions." She took back the ring and moved out the same day. The irony was almost overwhelming. Sarah, who had encouraged him to see me as beneath his social status, had abandoned him the moment his status faltered. The woman who had looked down on my modest lifestyle had fled when his lifestyle became even more modest than mine. "Her father made sure I can't get another job in finance," Daniel continued. "He has connections everywhere, and he's been telling people I'm unreliable, untrustworthy. I've been applying for months, but no one will hire me." Finally, he looked directly at me, and I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before. Genuine fear. Not the childhood fears I had always rushed to soothe, but adult terror at the consequences of his own actions. "I'm about to lose my apartment," he said. "I can't make the rent. I've been selling everything I own just to buy food, but it's not enough. I've been sleeping in my car some nights because I can't afford hotels." The dramatic irony of his situation was not lost on me. Here was the young man who had refused to spend money on his mother's medications, who had stolen from her while she was recovering from surgery, who had treated her like an embarrassment to be hidden from his sophisticated friends, now facing the same kind of desperation and homelessness he had forced her to endure. "I don't have anyone else to turn to," he said, his voice breaking completely. "Sarah's gone. Her family wants nothing to do with me. My friends from work have all disappeared. I know I haven't been a good son. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry, but you're the only family I have left." There it was. The apology that I had once craved, delivered not out of genuine remorse, but out of desperate need. He was sorry now, not because he understood the pain he had caused me, but because he needed something from me, and knew that some acknowledgement of wrongdoing was required to get it. "What exactly are you asking me for, Daniel?" I said quietly. "I need a place to stay," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Just temporarily, until I can get back on my feet. I know your apartment is small, but I could sleep on the couch. I wouldn't be any trouble, I promise. And maybe, if you could help me with a little money, just enough to get through the next few weeks." I set down my coffee cup and looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time since he had sat down. This man who had once dismissed me as someone who didn't fit into his life, who had stolen from me when I was at my most vulnerable, who had treated my love like an unwanted burden, was now asking me to save him from the consequences of his own choices. 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately. I would have opened my home, emptied my savings account, sacrificed my own stability to help him, just grateful for the chance to be needed by him again. I would have seen this crisis as an opportunity to prove my worth as a mother, to demonstrate that my love was unconditional and enduring. But the woman sitting in this cafe was not the woman who had begged for his attention from a hospital wheelchair. This woman understood the difference between love and enablement, between helping and being used, between family loyalty and self-destruction. "I see," I said calmly. "So now that you have no money, no job, no fiancé, and no friends, you'd like to return to the life you once found so embarrassing. You'd like to move back into the modest apartment you looked down on, accept help from the mother you introduced as a stranger, and rely on the financial support you once called a waste of money." Daniel's face flushed with shame, but also with something that looked like anger. He had clearly expected this to be easier, had assumed that maternal love would override any memory of past hurts. That need would automatically translate into assistance. "Mom, please," he said. "I know I made mistakes. I know I treated you badly, but I'm your son. Doesn't that mean anything anymore?" I looked at him for a long moment. This stranger who shared my DNA but had never truly shared my life, who had taken everything I offered and given nothing meaningful in return, who now wanted to trade on a relationship he had systematically destroyed. "You're right," I said finally. "You are my son. And because you're my son, I'm going to tell you the truth instead of enabling your self-destructive patterns. The truth is that you created this situation through your own choices. You chose to trust someone without doing your own research. You chose to invest money you couldn't afford to lose. You chose to borrow against your future income. You chose to prioritize material success over genuine relationships." His expression shifted from hope to confusion to something approaching panic as he realized this conversation wasn't going the way he had expected. "More importantly," I continued, "you chose to treat the people who loved you as disposable. You chose to steal from your mother while she was recovering from surgery. You chose to abandon her in a hospital when she needed basic help. You chose to be ashamed of the woman who sacrificed everything for your success." I paused, letting those words sink in, watching as the reality of his situation began to dawn on him. "Those weren't mistakes, Daniel. They were choices. And now you're facing the consequences of those choices, which is exactly what should happen to adults who make selfish decisions without considering how they affect other people." Daniel stared at me across the table, his mouth opening and closing like someone who had forgotten how to speak. The confident young man who had once dismissed me with casual cruelty was struggling to comprehend that his mother was no longer the desperate, broken woman he had abandoned in a hospital hallway. "But you're my mother," he said finally, as if that biological fact alone should override years of mistreatment and months of abandonment. "You're supposed to help me no matter what. That's what mothers do." I smiled then, not with bitterness or anger, but with the peaceful clarity of someone who had finally learned the difference between love and self-destruction. "You're absolutely right," I said. "That is what mothers do. We help our children learn to become responsible, caring, independent adults. We teach them about consequences, about treating other people with respect, about the importance of building genuine relationships based on mutual care rather than one-sided taking." I reached into my purse and pulled out a piece of paper I had been carrying for weeks, ever since I suspected this moment might eventually come. It was a list I had written during one of my counseling sessions, a record of every sacrifice I had made for Daniel over the years, every dollar I had spent on his education and well-being, every opportunity I had foregone to support his dreams. "This is what a mother's love looks like," I said, sliding the paper across the table toward him. 18 years of putting your needs before my own, $60,000 in educational expenses, countless hours of homework help, emotional support, and unconditional encouragement. 2 jobs worked simultaneously to pay for your college. My grandmother's wedding ring sold to buy you a car. My own dreams deferred so you could pursue yours." Daniel glanced at the paper, his face growing paler with each item he read. "All of that was given freely, with joy, because I believed I was raising a son who would grow up to be a good man," I continued. "A man who understood that love is supposed to flow in both directions, that family means caring for each other during difficult times, that success is meaningless if it comes at the cost of your integrity and compassion." I paused to take a sip of my coffee, noting how Daniel's hands were shaking as he held the paper. Around us, the cafe continued its normal afternoon rhythm, other people having pleasant conversations, students studying, couples sharing desserts. Normal life proceeding as it should, filled with people who understood how to treat each other with basic kindness. But instead, I said, I raised someone who saw my love as an entitlement rather than a gift. Someone who took everything I offered and gave nothing meaningful in return. Someone who felt ashamed of the woman who made his success possible and who abandoned her the moment she needed help. "Mom, please," Daniel whispered. And for the first time I heard something that might have been genuine remorse in his voice rather than just strategic manipulation. "I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you, but I'm desperate. I have nowhere else to go." "I understand that you're desperate," I replied calmly. I remember that feeling very well. I remember lying in a hospital bed, having just survived surgery, and calling my only child for help. I remember being told that helping his own mother would be a waste of money. I remember discovering that my son had robbed me while I was recovering from a life-threatening operation. Daniel winced at each word, but I continued without mercy. Not because I wanted to cause him pain, but because I wanted him to understand the full scope of what he had done. I remember sleeping in my car because I couldn't afford rent, eating one meal a day because I couldn't afford food, choosing between my medications and my utilities because I couldn't afford both. Do you know what the worst part was, Daniel? It wasn't the physical discomfort or even the financial stress. It was the realization that the person I had loved most in the world saw me as so worthless that my suffering didn't matter to him at all. Tears were streaming down Daniel's face now, but I felt no satisfaction in his pain, no sense of revenge or vindication. This wasn't about punishing him. It was about refusing to enable his continued selfishness and irresponsibility. "But you know what I learned during those terrible months?" I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I learned that I am worth more than someone's last resort. I learned that love should never require me to disappear, to sacrifice my dignity, to accept cruelty in exchange for scraps of affection. I learned that being a good mother doesn't mean being a doormat for an ungrateful child." I reached across the table and gently took the paper back from his trembling hands, folding it carefully and returning it to my purse. "So, no, Daniel, I will not let you move into my apartment. I will not give you money to bail you out of the consequences of your own poor decisions. I will not rescue you from a situation you created through your own selfishness and irresponsibility." The words hung in the air between us, final and unmovable. Daniel looked like a drowning man watching his last lifeline disappear beneath the waves. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "Where am I supposed to go?" "You're supposed to figure it out," I said simply, "the same way I figured it out when you abandoned me. The same way millions of people figure it out every day when they face difficulties without family support. You're supposed to take responsibility for your choices and find ways to rebuild your life through your own efforts." I stood up, gathering my purse and coat with the calm efficiency of someone who had said everything that needed to be said. "But Mom," Daniel called out desperately as I prepared to leave, "what if I can't? What if I end up homeless? What if something terrible happens to me?" I turned back to look at him one last time, this man who had once been my whole world, but who had never truly been my son in any meaningful way. He had been a project, a recipient of my devotion, someone I had loved without ever being loved in return. "Then you'll learn what I learned," I said quietly. "That rock bottom is a solid foundation to build a new life on. That losing everything can teach you what actually matters. That sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened." I paused, feeling the weight of everything I was about to say, the finality of this moment that had been building for months. "And maybe, if you're very lucky, you'll learn what it means to earn love instead of expecting it, to give support instead of just taking it, to build relationships based on mutual respect instead of one-sided exploitation." As I walked toward the cafe door, I heard him call out one last time, "I love you, Mom. Doesn't that count for anything?" I stopped, my hand on the door handle, and turned back to face him. Love is not a feeling, Daniel. Love is a choice. It's choosing to show up when someone needs you. It's choosing to put someone else's well-being ahead of your own comfort. It's choosing to treat people with kindness and respect, even when it's inconvenient. You may have feelings for me, but you have never chosen to love me. And I finally love myself too much to accept anything less than real love. I walked out of that cafe into the golden afternoon sunlight, leaving behind the last remnants of the woman who had once measured her worth by her son's approval. The cool autumn air felt like freedom, like possibility, like the beginning of everything that came after the end of everything that had been. 6 months later, I would receive a letter from Daniel. He had found work as a warehouse clerk, was living in a small studio apartment, had started attending counseling sessions to address what he called his entitlement issues. He wrote about learning to appreciate small kindnesses from coworkers, about understanding for the first time what it felt like to earn rather than expect help from others. He wrote about being sorry, truly sorry, for the pain he had caused me. The letter was thoughtful, humble, and honest in ways his previous communications had never been. It ended with a simple request, not for money or shelter or immediate forgiveness, but for the possibility that someday, when he had proven through actions rather than words that he had learned to be a better person, we might be able to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect. I wrote back, telling him that I was proud of the progress he was making, that I hoped he would continue to grow and learn, and that perhaps someday, when he had demonstrated sustained change over a significant period of time, we could explore the possibility of a different kind of relationship, one between two adults who chose to care for each other rather than one person giving and another person taking. But that was still in the future. On this afternoon, walking away from the cafe where I had finally set myself free, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace with my own choices, complete confidence in my own worth, complete excitement about a future that belonged entirely to me. I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their selfishness. I had learned that you can forgive someone without allowing them to continue hurting you. I had learned that being a good mother sometimes means letting your child face the full consequences of their choices, even when those consequences are painful. Most importantly, I had learned that I was never just somebody's mother. I was Marta Rodriguez, a woman with dreams, talents, interests, and value that existed completely independent of anyone else's opinion or approval, and that woman was worth protecting, worth investing in, worth loving. The fluorescent lights of that hospital hallway seemed like a lifetime ago. The broken woman in the wheelchair, begging for scraps of attention from an ungrateful son, had been transformed into someone I was genuinely proud to be. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never again allow anyone to make me feel invisible in my own life. I was finally free, finally whole, finally home in my own skin, and it felt like the beginning of everything beautiful that was yet to come.